Good evening and welcome to the third Askwith Forum of this academic year. I'm Bob Schwartz, a longtime faculty member here. I've had different roles over the years at this institution, and I now am a senior research fellow with the emphasis on senior. 4 years ago now, in 2011, with two colleagues at Harvard, an economist named Ron Ferguson from the Kennedy School and a visiting journalist named Bill Simons, we released a report called Pathways to Prosperity, Meeting the Challenge of Preparing Young Americans for the 21st Century. In that report, we made basically kind of three points. This is the 1 minute version of the report. We first looked at the proportion of young people by the age of 25 who were attaining any kind of a post-secondary degree or credential. And after 20 years of the standards movement, only about, actually at that point, fewer than one young American in three had a 4-year degree. If you added into the equation those with a 2-year degree or a 1-year post-secondary certificate, that got you just over 50%, which raised the question, what is our national strategy for the other half of young Americans in an economy in which the returns to skills and credentials are rising, it seems, almost by the week. The second point we made is that when you looked at the labor market projections in terms of the skill requirements, we clearly were moving into an economy in which at least 2/3 of the jobs would require some kind of a post-secondary credential. So obviously when people talk about the skills gap, this is the gap between what the expectations and requirements of the economy are and the current education levels of our population. Within that projection of 2/3 of jobs requiring some post-secondary education, we particularly zeroed in on the fact that it looked from the economists whose work we were reading that despite the earlier predictions that we were moving into a world in which the middle was hollowing out of the economy and we were only going to have two kinds of jobs, high-skill, high-wage jobs for those with at least a 4-year degree and low-wage, low-skill jobs for everybody else. It was now increasingly clear that for the foreseeable future there would continue to be at least roughly 30% of good jobs with good wages requiring some education beyond high school, certainly. Ideally, the best of the jobs, technician jobs requiring a pretty solid underpinning of so-called STEM skills, but not necessarily requiring a 4-year degree. The third point, and what's really relevant for this evening's panel, is we said, if you look outside the US, and particularly if you look to Europe, there are a whole set of countries that seem to do much better at preparing the full range of young people to be effective participants in their labor market. And we particularly, I'm going to just show you quickly two slides from that report. This one shows a set of countries in Europe where between 40 and 70% of young people between the ages of 16 and 19 are in very strong vocational programs. The ones with the darker whatever you want to call that, darker color, reflect those systems in which students are actually splitting their time between learning at a workplace and learning in a more academic setting. And the country with the highest proportion of its young people in what we call dual system programs, that is programs that really where they are spending typically 3 days a week learning at a workplace, 2 days a week in an aligned academic program, happens to be Switzerland. When we looked at youth unemployment, particularly again looking at what had happened during the recession, where at the right end, at the far end of this slide, you'll see those countries where the bottom had basically fallen out of the economy. In Southern Europe, countries like Spain and Greece, where nearly 50% of young people were unemployed. The US, as you can see, is kind of in the middle of the pack, ranging between 16 or 18% youth unemployment, actually much, much more severe in some of our inner cities and rural communities. I think 40% would be a more accurate estimate at that point, at least in urban America. But way at this end of the graph, what you see is the countries with the strongest vocational systems and with the most young people in vocational education. And again, it's Austria, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Norway. without saying more about that report, it was Switzerland that, for a bunch of reasons, caught my eye and the eye of Nancy Hoffman, who's on this panel with me. We had a chance to visit Switzerland actually just before the release of the report, and have been back several times since. The National Center on Education and the Economy, a U.S. organization, policy organization, both a think tank and a do tank, as it calls itself, has been the organization in the U.S. that over the last 25 years has really, I think, done the best job of trying to expose U.S. policymakers in particular to lessons that could be learned from high-performing systems. That organization decided to launch a study of strong vocational education programs, and Switzerland was one of the countries that we first looked at through that study. Main speaker of the evening, the kind of featured attraction here, is Ursula Renold. Ursula was for 12 years the leader of the federal office that oversees the vocational education and training system in Switzerland. As it happens, just as she was exiting that role in 2012, actually we met at a World Skills Forum in London. She said she was had support for the next several months and was looking for a place to come and learn. And she came and joined us as a visiting fellow on the faculty here at the Graduate School of Education, just as we were starting up a national network of states that had come together in part to respond to the challenges that we put forth in the Pathways to Prosperity report. And Ursula is going to walk us through kind of some slides showing the main features of the Swiss system, what some of its outcomes are, as well as what some of its current challenges are.
So thank you very much, Bob, for this very warm welcome, and it's a pleasure for me to contribute to this Askwith forum and to share with you some insights of the Swiss vocational and educational training system. I would like to emphasize the 5 points. I show you a little bit the distinctive features of the Swiss VPET system. VPET means Vocational and Professional Education and Training System, and selected outcome effects. After that, I explain you how the governance of the Swiss VPET system and the roles of the involved stakeholders works. Furthermore, I explain what I understand by curriculum value chain. What does it mean, how we design curriculum, how we apply curriculum, and of course to the benefit of the outcome. And then maybe one of the really big differences to other countries is that we have an apprenticeship market. So I will explain you how these young kids enroll in an apprenticeship, how they can apply for a job as an apprentice on the apprenticeship market, and how important this transition phase from compulsory education to the upper secondary too is. Finally, I sum up with strengths and weaknesses of our system. First of all, why is Switzerland in the focus actually? Switzerland is on the top when it comes to innovation scoreboard, world competitiveness report, world competitive yearbooks, and as well competitive index from ADECO. It's among the top. And when I was in my former function, journalists especially asked me, how could you explain that you are on the top in almost all of these rankings, but you have only about 20% of enrollment rates at university? Then, well, I tell them, if you have 30 minutes time, I explain you how our education system works. So I will explain you that now, that the big difference makes the vocational and professional education system. In our institute, we create some benchmarking instruments too. One of our recently released instrument is the CUF Youth Labor Market Index, where we created an index out of 12 indicators. I only show you here the index value. The higher the index value is, the better the country is. And we have 12 indicators behind those index, which describe the situation of the young generation in the age of 15 to 25 years in those countries. What you see is what happened after the economic crisis. So those countries having dual vocational education system, like Switzerland, Germany, Betsy talked about, they keep going. They are quite stable with regards to the situation of the young generation. While Ireland, Spain, Greece, all those southern European countries, they fall down. So especially Spain is a disaster in Europe. Not only that they have a very high youth unemployment rate, the working conditions of those youngsters are very bad. So this is for me the outcome. We have to make sure that the next generation has really a good starting point when it comes to their career path. So now turning back to the Swiss education system, this is quite a complex slide. I don't need to explain you everything in detail. What you see is here actually that with 15 years, we end up in a compulsory school in Switzerland, and then we have basically two possibilities to move on. The one is the vocational education and training system, where we have 3 or 4 year programs as well as 2-year programs for the more practical gifted people. And on the other hand, you have this typical high school setting, the academic baccalaureate. Now, we are talking now about this green field, this vocational field, where we have, Bob mentioned that, 70% of our kids enroll in apprenticeship in the age of 15 to 16 years and choose this pathway. This is exceptional worldwide. And I have to say, I myself started in my first education with an apprenticeship in a bank. But it's not about tracking. You know, you can think that if you are once in this pathway, you are staying in the practical field. No, that's not the system in Switzerland. Those arrows show you how you can proceed. So the system is totally permeable. You can, I go back, you can do here the vocational baccalaureate in addition to a vocational apprenticeship, and this allows you to go directly to the University of Applied Sciences, or if you do an additional year of general education, you can enter directly in the highest ranked university. The same for those kids who are choosing as a first entry pathway into upper secondary to general education. They can do that, but later on they can move on to the practical part of our education system. So this is important to understand. There is no tracking in Switzerland. You just enter in the age of 15 to 16 in one of this possibility, and if you end up with one of your credential in the age of 19, 20, you can go and move on either in the academic field or in the practical higher education system. Switzerland wasn't like that all the time, and that is important to understand, and that gives hope to all the education leaders which are involved in reforms. I show you here, since 78, we constantly reform the system towards what the labor market is looking for. We build up or reform the tertiary education system in the professional education sector. Then, and this was the absolute important reform, it's the vocational baccalaureate and the University of Applied Sciences, which is the direct route from the vocational path to the university system. And if you have this kind of pathways, then you can make the VET system very attractive, because people realize this is not a dead-end education, this is just a first entry into the labor market, but whenever you have the chance to go on, or you are in the mood to go on, you can go on. The whole life, it's not limited to some age. What we also invented is, in 2004, this 2-year vocational education with a federal credential for those who are not that strong academically, but are practical gifted. Also, those people can go to the 3 or 4 year education if they finished and if they think I would like to take the career ladder. So what is important is, if you analyze the labor market, what they really need, if you analyze your education system from time to time, you realize that a substantial proportion of the cohort needs a different pathway. So functional differentiation over time of a system is very important. We are all in the middle of reforms in all states, in all countries, and that is important to understand. Now what you see here is the last 10 years. This is the upper secondary 2 cohort. The biggest proportion, as Prof. Schwartz already mentioned, went through the vocational education route, and it's still growing. You know, we are, with 2004, 64% or 65%. Nowadays we have 71. So people realize in Switzerland, we have 2 tickets. At the end of a vocational education, we have a ticket into the labor market and have a ticket for higher education. And this has a higher value, meanwhile, for these young kids. Another goal was, we really would like to make sure that every kid after the compulsory school get access to some upper secondary school, and you see we are quite successful. Almost 95% of this cohort gets an upper secondary 2 credential. Now, occupation and career paths, those kids in the age of 15 to 16 years can choose among 230 different occupations. You see the hit list, the 20 most important occupation from commercial employee. I was doing that when I was working on a bank. Then we have the retail clerk, healthcare worker, social care worker, electricians, IT technicians, cook, mechanical engineer, dragsman, retail assistant, logistician, automotive mechanical, and so on. The big difference to your country is that the occupation is the work structuring principle and not the company itself. And this is something you have to understand because this is very important for the whole system. It facilitates the system if you have a small number of occupation and not 18,000 like the national vocational qualification in UK, for example, are. So another feature is, if you are enrolling in an apprenticeship in Switzerland, you are 1 or 2 days a week at school, and 3 to 4 days you are learning and working in a company. Important is to know that in a company, this is structured learning. So every company has a syllabus, and they know what to do during the 3 or 4 years. Now, the flip side is, all the time we are asking, is this really what the labor market is looking for? We have innovation panel data of our small and medium industry panel, and we observe if the need is really here, still here. What you see is from our survey, 96 up to 2013, the percentage of employee with highest education degree, around 50% do have this kind of vocational diploma. So it's the majority. It's half of the workforce in the Swiss SME industry has that. So that is really an important message. But what is also important is those people having only compulsory education, that's not what the labor market is looking for in the future. On the other hand, growing demand of professional education diploma, University of Applied diploma, as well as of the conventional university. But people having in Switzerland a conventional university degree, bachelor, master, or PhD, is about 8 to 9% only in the small and medium companies. So that's really important to understand. Now, you see the Swiss companies are very engaged in the Swiss VET system. And the slide I show you now shows a little bit about what are the incentives for a strong CTE success. It's called the public-private partnership. Our Swiss companies, they consider VET as an investment. and it's a business model. At the end of the 3 to 4 year, it pays off in the average for companies. Why? Because, I mean, you see here, 60% of the overall expenditure of the overall costs are taken by the companies. But what you see here is the cost side is only one factor. They have a benefit out of this training engagement, and the benefit is higher than the cost, so they have a net benefit. And this is the incentive in our industry. On the other hand, the flip side for the public expenditure for the government is they have to pay only around 40%, which helps to improve universities. With the rest of the money, we can build strong universities. So this is a win-win situation for everybody. And now, of course, it's important to know how you get there. And that's not that easy, but I'm sure you could do that in your country too. You have a liberal labor market. You have companies in competition. The only thing is what you need is kind of intermediary organization, because not every company itself can do that. Now, governance, I'm just go ahead with how you can do that. In Switzerland, and this is maybe in Germany, in Austria the same, we have a very good partnership among those three partners. In Switzerland, Switzerland has the size of Massachusetts, or the inhabitants similar to Colorado. It's about 8 million inhabitants, so we are a small country. And the Confederation is the guiding force on federal level, but not with regard to content. The content is developed by the so-called Professional Association, Association of Manufacturer, Association of Banking and Finance, and so we have 600 of those professional organizations. They define the training content. So they make sure that it's really up to date and it's what the labor market is looking for. Behind Professional Association, you have those companies which offer those training places. The implementation actors are the 26 cantons. It's like states in your country. And they are the supervision authority. They make sure that every company do what they need, what they should do. And if all the partners work closely together, we have this benefit. So that's very important that you work on partnerships. What are professional associations? What is the role of unions in Switzerland? We have a kind of two different types of national organization. On the one hand, we have these policy-making bodies. They are in commissions. They are member of federal expert groups. They deal with these political issues. On the other hand, we have the 600 national professional association. These are the bodies who define the content, the framework curriculum of each of these 230 occupations. The unions are involved in policy issues, but they are not that strong in Switzerland as, for example, in Germany. So only if unions are involved in collective labor agreement, then they play a role. But we have only 40 of them, 40 this kind of agreements, so it's not that strong, the union influence. On the regional level, we have trade, we have regional chamber of trade association, but they are basically there for the promotion of apprenticeship. They help in the matching between students and companies, and that's it. So if you have a good governance, if you have those partnerships between the Confederation, the government, and the professional association, this good governance has an impact on the curriculum value chain. That means the process from curriculum design to curriculum application, you measure the outcome, you measure the impact on the labor market, and last but not least, on the competitiveness of the whole economy. We ask questions like, how is it organized, this partnership, and how is it managed? What are the incentives which stimulates coordination? That's one of the most important questions. What does it deliver in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and equity? That is what we measure all 4 years in order to make sure that we are on track and that we know what we have to improve. Now, apprenticeship market. it's a difficult question for some people here in the States to imagine that within the age of 15 years, you are approaching a market. You apply yourself on the apprenticeship market for a job as an apprentice. 80,000 young kids do that every year. And of course, in order that they are successful, we need a kind of support agency. We have very well developed career guidance and counseling centers. So in the 7th grade, we start with this kind of career guidance at the compulsory level. Teachers go to the career guidance center, the career guidance go to school, they organize events for parents, and they start to think, what is my kid doing at the end of compulsory school? What options do they have? They can make tests, they can explore what they would like to do. They make, Betsy told me in English, it's called sniffing course. They try out for 1 week if carpentry is my profession or if I would like to go for a banker, whatever. And then they guide parents, students through the whole process until they know how to apply for a job as an apprentice. And this is basically done in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And we know, as you see, 5% of every cohort may have difficulties. And for those people, we have bridging courses, also for those kids who don't know what to do at the age of 15, can happen. And therefore, we help teachers to identify those group at risk, because those group at risk, they need a kind of special treatment, and for that, the Career Guidance Center or our Case Management Center are looking for to help them. Finally, I end up with the strengths of the Swiss VPET system. It's strongly employer and market-driven. It's learning on the best available technology. If you are working 3 to 4 days in a company, you are all the time on the best available technology. We don't have to care about if our school have enough money to buy CNC machines, 3D printer, or facilities like that. It goes along with their work in the company. Effective tripartite partnership between confederation, cantons, and professional organization is really something very important. Then those national organizations, they set the standard of excellence. They say what they need in 5 or 8 years in the companies. A well-balanced mix of academic and professional skills in every occupation is crucial in order to secure the mobility in the labor market. We wanted them to go on after the apprenticeship in higher education. Therefore, a minimum of academic skill is crucial. Very strong tertiary professional education system we have. I didn't explain that in detail, but that's important, especially for lifelong learning. Then, of course, permeability from one pathway to the other. We don't have the discussion about tracking. People know in Switzerland, I just enter somewhere and then go on according to your passion, according to what you would like to do as a next step. All professionals, instructor, teacher, whatever you name it, in VPET have additional trainings. We have minimal standards for teacher in the VET field as well as for instructor, and this is important for quality. Quality control in general is ensured and national assessed by different bodies, and at least, last but not least, Career Guidance Center. Here we are at Harvard, so some of the PhD students are here. I really would like to emphasize, every state has to run a research program. You need to know what works if you are doing your reform. We make good experience. For 15 years, we invest, we make capacity building in research in the field of vocational education training, and I just can motivate all the students here. This is a fascinating topic. It's complex, but it's fascinating, and there are not so many people around who really understand how to do this research. Weaknesses of the Swiss PET system. Well, we are facing a demographic change with shrinking cohorts of number. that may sharpen competition between academic and vocational education. Globalization affects us in two ways. Entry of international companies without training tradition threatens the Swiss dual-track learning arrangements. And on the other hand, our national languages are German, French, Italian, and Romansh, but not English. But nowadays, everything is in English, so this is a challenge for us. Well, that's the overview about the Swiss education system. We are looking forward to talking with you. Thank you very much.
Crew, I said finish at by 6:30, so we'll have plenty of time for questions at 6:31. We have 2 mics. The ground rule is please questions, not speeches. If you have somebody you want to direct your question to, great, but if you just want to toss it out for anyone on the panel to respond to, that's fine as well. While you're gathering your thoughts, I just wanted to make a couple of comments to just amplify a lot of the things that we've heard. Nancy and I, with Ursula obviously, have now had the occasion to take 3 groups of Americans to spend a week looking at the system. Actually, last fall we took 45 people, a group of chief state school officers from states, some foundation folks, some congressional staffers, and others. And I always say to people, don't worry about the details of the system. You can take your time and learn to understand that. Use your time here to do 2 things. Talk to kids and talk to employers. And I think if you, and this is implied, I think, in certainly what Nancy's comments, if you talk to young people, both those who are in the system and in some ways more interestingly, those who are in their early to mid-20s, reflecting back on their experiences, what you see is that this isn't simply about preparing young people for the workforce. This is about helping young people make a successful, positive transition from adolescence to adulthood, to come out the other end with confidence, a resume, a sense of self, and a sense that they now have some opportunities and options in the world that they didn't have before. Final comment I'd make, and that again implicit in what others have said here, but catching kids early and socializing them into work and the meaning of work in human life, and doing it in an environment in which there is a ton of adult coaching and support. It's much easier to get adults to engage with 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds and to do it in ways. A Boston CEO, a kind of crusty Boston CEO, said to me at one point, he said, you know, I'm not sure about this apprenticeship model, but he said, I could get you as many mentors as you wanted. My company is full of 50-year-old guys who may not be able to talk to their own kids, but would be perfectly effective in talking to somebody else's 15 or 16-year-old. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So, first question.
Thanks, terrific panel. Personal to me, I grew up in Switzerland, so I spent half of my life there. I'm a product of a system that was not as permeable then as it is now. So I'm very curious about the reform. I've been studying workforce development for 20 years in this country. And the key to me, one of the key differences is that federal policy, I think in this country, is relatively weak, and there's some who would like it to be weaker yet. So I'm just curious how, even though the Swiss system is also federal and has, you know, many layers, how there is more, there's stronger levers, it seems to me. And then the other part of the question is funding has been shrinking in this country, in workforce development in particular. So we have less, fewer resources really to work with. And I think the engagement of employers has been a challenge for WIBs and workforce boards and so forth. So I'm just curious what policy options there are in a country where the federal policy making is a little weaker than in Switzerland.
Who wants to take a first cut at that?
Well, maybe you can start with the role of the federal government. I was in charge for 12 years in this function. Just call me the facilitator. The crucial actors are those of the professional association. So I have to make sure that they are on track, they have every information, and that they know how to get access to money if they would like to reform the system. Since 2004, we have a new legislation, and in this new legislation, the Member of Parliament decided that 10% of the public expenditure have to be spent for research and development project. This is 80 million Swiss francs a year. So this is very important, because with that you really can constantly make your reforms and improve the material, technology, learning treatments, and so on. So this was really a crucial thing. But the role of Switzerland, if you compare that with the United States, I would say running a system on a state level in this country is the right thing. Yeah. Because the federal government here could play the same role as we had in Switzerland. But as Noel told, what is really crucial is that you build up a system on a state level. And that, in my view, you know better than I do, but that should be possible. And then you have a better talk together with those intermediaries. Because in Switzerland, for example, we had a discussion about should vocational education be a role of the states, the cantons. They rejected because of the industry. The industry says, Switzerland, 8 million people, we would like to have a national labor market. And those credentials should be recognized in the whole national labor market. And I think that should be the same case for this country.
Nancy?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Ursula said, and that's why we're working with the state as the unit and with state policy leaders who have the same kind of vision that Noel just explained. I think in terms of the federal government, the tradition of the federal government, and a good thing, is a focus on equity and on those who are least well served. And so when we look at what is going on in the Department of Labor, for example, it tends to be about displaced workers and low-skilled workers. And that's not, as much as we need that, that's not the framework that we bring when we think about this vocational system. It's really, what we're trying to do is create a majority system that, in a sense, says young people need to learn about work and learn to work, and they need to be out of the box of a school during their adolescence. And that's a vision states and regions can take on, but not one that I think the federal government will easily adopt. I think
No,
Noel
quick comment, and then we'll go.
The one last thing I'll say is what impressed me, one of the many things that impressed me, is that business and industry was paying for this, the training centers and the apprenticeships within Switzerland, so they weren't depending on government to do that. And that's a big piece of what their financial model is built on, because it pays for them to do that. And it also changes the burden to say, we have to raise taxes, because we're not. We're doing this in our self-interest in industry, and that's, I think, a key building block.
Thanks. Yes.
I'm Joan Bissell. I'm the Director of Teacher Education and Public School Programs for the California State University. Used to be your colleagues here. I do a lot of work in California with what we now call linked learning. It used to be called Multiple Pathways. It's led by the James Irvine Foundation. And I would like your advice on the 2 or 3 actions that would be most effective in moving the dime forward in California. I say that with hearing the business and industry engagement is absolutely critical. But there are so many deeper issues. I mean, there are issues about our post-secondary education system, about values, about equity, about race and ethnicity. And I think we all know those, but at the same time, there's a will to move ahead. So what are the 2 or 3 things that you would do to help us get a little bit closer?
The reason I smile, I'm going to step out of my moderator role here for a minute, is that California is one of the states in our network, and I happen to have worked pretty closely with both the legislative leadership and the State Department in the design and development of what has been a $500 million investment in something called the Career Pathways Trust.
This is one of the most important things that's happened in California in a decade.
And just a quick comment, and then we'll let others jump in here. Linked learning is a kind of Cadillac version of the Career Academies program. It is, but basically, it's a high school reform program. Its design is to, by engaging kids, by helping them see the integration of academic and career work to get through high school. What the Career Pathways Trust envisions is actually, its ultimate goal is preparing kids for employment. And it has it not only is a high school program, but it's designed to span into at least the first 2 years of post-secondary education, and then to act for those who want to go on, absolutely to continue on into the 4-year system. My particular hypothesis, still to be tested, is that I think it will be a lot easier at scale to engage employers with particularly the 2-year post-secondary system, because a lot of our best community colleges have histories of actually being responsive to employer needs, designing customized training programs for incumbent workers. What we don't typically have, however, is strategies where employers and educators together design degree programs, or programs that really will give young people the kind of credentials they need to take a next step. And that's still a hypothesis yet to be tested, but I think I worry about the challenge of getting employers to engage at scale with high schools. There are too many of them, they look too complicated, you've got scheduling barriers, you've got a whole bunch of issues that kind of get in the way. Just final comment on this, and that is, when Ursula described the Swiss system, it takes you a while to get your head around the notion that compulsory education actually ends at the end of what in our terms used to be junior high school. So that in some ways, what that means is it kind of concentrates everybody's attention on getting kids to a point by age 15 where first they've got core academic skills mastered, but second they're in a position then to make some choices about what they want to do next. For us, for better or worse, our high school system is designed to end at the end of high school. Right. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes it challenging to act on what some of us have been arguing for, and that is intervening much earlier with kids and getting them into workplaces. But
Bob, that was a superb answer. Thank you. I really value
let others jump in. Thanks, Joan. Yeah.
I think that one thing if you haven't already, is to look really hard at the example in Switzerland of their career guidance system. I mean, we know ours is extraordinarily weak. I don't know the numbers in California, but in the high schools in the state I live in, it's 1 to 600. And what can one counselor do for 600 kids to help lead them to a future? So that's something I think easily read about. You can talk to folks, and very critical element of the system.
And very relevant.
Yeah. I would say 2 other things, because Bob really we could call that number 1 on the list. And I also look at my 3 members of my team are here who work in California. We are working very hard on early career advising, starting in middle school, and yes. We've Toby Baker-Wright, who leads a project for us, which is called Possible Futures, Possible Selves. And that's a long project, but starting with younger students, as Ursula suggested, is really important. The second thing I would say is in California, there is developing a sector-based strategy, particularly around healthcare, which seems to be in high demand all over the country. So my second thing is, let's work with a sector that's used to having people in and out of its space, where there are strong career pathways as well as options at the 2- and 4-year levels. And you're doing good work yourself, Joan. So keep it up.
These are great answers.
Next, yes.
Well, it's a great idea to integrate vocational and academic training, but there have been some experiments with this in what's usually referred to as internships here through junior colleges and so forth. And some people claim that that's just a way for industry to get cheap labor because they don't have to pay the same rate that they would to experienced workers, and it may either displace the number of hours or the number of workers that are more experienced that the industry would need to fill those same positions. So I'm wondering what the impact is on wages and opportunities for more experienced workers. And also, I'm wondering about the vicissitudes of the larger macroeconomy, whether you can maintain continuity in these programs in a recession, for instance, which would make it probably more difficult, especially for experienced workers, to accept a lot of this influx of cheaper, younger workers.
Ursula, why don't you start on the Swiss answer, and then Noel from the U.S. perspective.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree with you. This is a problem, and it's a growing problem in Europe too. We call it Generation EI internship. in Europe, it's basically for university degree graduates. They have to do an internship, at least one. In Switzerland and in Germany, they are still paid. But I heard that in some other countries, they are not anymore paid. So you are right. And from an entrepreneur point of view, I mean, of course, it's cheap labor. But the argument why they do that is they have to first train them. And well, I'm actually discussing with a group of people in Switzerland if they could develop an apprenticeship for university graduate which lasts just 1 year, but is a structured apprenticeship, structured year in a company so that they can calculate what is the cost benefit. That is crucial. And then we have a fair discussion about the wage.
And my thoughts are that there will always be in our world people that will abuse the system. But I think a lot of times it's the 1% that make the headlines and the 99% that actually are trying to do this for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. And my observation of business, not just in the manufacturing world, but beyond, is there is a clear awareness of this gap in skills that isn't being met. And if we don't have a system in place that will help address that, our economy itself will impact all of us in a negative way. When people say that it's cheap labor, it is only for the reasons that Ursula said, because we're training them. The cost to my business in the first 2 years, based on the models that I've studied, it's a net loss for me for the first 2 years. So I have to front end the investment in that apprentice before it hits, a point where they're starting to generate revenue with that apprenticeship wage. So at the end of the day, you hit neutral at the end of the 4-year apprenticeship. So my belief is it's a way to kind of rebuild our country and make it much more competitive. The other phenomena that's going on right now in my industry is we're creating wage bubbles for some of these high-skilled positions. So a toolmaker, last year when they came to apply for a job at my company, they'd want $65,000 a year. Well, today we had somebody come in realistically asking for $90,000 to $100,000 a year. And so during the next recession, as we're filling these positions because we have no choice, people will start losing their jobs. And in the Swiss model, there is a moderation to that because you're never over or under building a market, a skill set, because you have the apprenticeship marketplace. So I think although right now we're seeing wages build disproportionate to the real value, that's not healthy. And I think in the long term, this system is better for the workers as well as the businesses as well as the general economy.
You put your finger on what I think is a real problem or a real issue. And one of the things we saw in Denmark, for example, where the vocational system has rapidly lost market share. We were told really for 2 reasons. One is that people were blaming the U.S., that our kind of college for all mentality has kind of, infected parents there, and to their consternation of policymakers, because they have, like us now, a lot of unemployed 4-year college graduates. But the more important point relative to your question is that this works in Switzerland because of the gap between the apprentice wage and the wage of the full worker. If that balance gets out of whack, and in Denmark and Germany, where unions are more powerful, they argued to close that gap, and they raised the wages of apprentices to the point where it no longer became a viable proposition for somebody, like Noel. So this trying to figure out, how do you make this a win-win situation where it's ultimately for employers, again, it's over time, over a 3 or 4 year period. As Noel says, initially it's all cost and no benefit, but at some point that gets into balance. But if you can't persuade employers that at the end of the day, there is the gain in bottom line productivity for the firm at least balances off the costs and wages and training costs, it's going to be hard to get employers to play at scale. Betsy, you had a comment?
Also think what you'll see in these systems that are where business is heavily invested, is that they're deeply involved in the development of the qualification system, what the students get at the end of their time with the companies.
Right.
And because they're so heavily involved, they're much more up to date. And if there's a slight downturn, you know, because of the qualifications they developed typically are actually broader than what you see most of the times in the United States, there's more staying power. And we can see that by the historic data.
Thanks. We have time for 2 more questions, and I want to leave kind of 1 minute for each panelist if they choose to make a final observation, and then we'll try to close this out by 7. So you're on.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective. My name's Ryan Flynn. I'd like to ask you about the role of government in enabling business associations to play the intermediary role that they do. In my experience, when these don't form organically, there's often considerable barriers to having business associations play this role. It might be funding, it might be that businesses don't exactly know what their skills needs will be. It may be that they don't have the convening power. So we have such a broad perspective on the panel. I'd be interested to know how you think government can usefully intervene when there is cause to do so. Thank you.
Thanks. No?
So there's a few areas I think they can be helpful on, hoping they'll be helpful in Colorado. One is in infrastructure, because to build the system initially is going to cost much more than any one industry organization or industry sector could pay for. And it is a public good. So providing kind of startup money, infrastructure costs, is an important piece. Second, incentives for the early adopters to participate. And what I mean by that is tax credits for companies potentially that bring in apprentices to help offset the cost, because the financial model that I learned about only works when you hit critical mass. So that's another piece. The third that I've really asked our leaders in Colorado to participate with is they have a bully pulpit and they talk to a lot of people. And if our governor is out there talking about think differently to business, think differently about your role, they can sway minds, they do. And so I think to be an advocate to provide potential startup funding, but ultimately, I say this, hopefully I won't regret it, is over time, the cost of this needs to transition to industry. And we'll do it because it makes sense to our bottom line.
Ursula, would you comment on the role that your federal office played in supporting employer associations in the role they were ultimately able to play?
First, I fully agree with what Noel said. It's exactly the way I would do it here in the States. In Switzerland, the federal government subsidizes no companies directly, strictly no company, because it works if you have once a system. But if you start with a new professional association, as we did that in 2004 in the healthcare sector or in the IT sector in the 90s, we didn't have this kind of professional association, then we subsidize some of their works exactly in the way as Noel described that, so that they can build up own professional association until they is really embedded in the whole system. But from the point where they all developed their first framework curriculum, the whole material, educate all the professionals, from that point on, they have to be sustainable in their own financial system.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Peiwen. Thank you for this conversation. So I'm from Singapore, and I was wondering, how exactly do you in Switzerland achieve the permeability you talk about? Because I think a problem that we struggle, especially in Singapore, is getting, being able to, allowing the students to be able to go from different tracks. And I think we also struggle with societal perceptions of people who go into vocational training, as well as potentially wage ceilings for them. So I was wondering, how do you get around that problem in Switzerland?
Yeah, that's a big issue is the social status. And, well, the more you have which start with their first education in the vocational route, the better it is for the status itself. And it's, I think Bob mentioned that, we don't have only vocational routes for those which are academically not that well gifted. We have routes for everybody. We have an apprenticeship in dancing, for example, in social work, in every field. So that's important that you don't just reduce the VET system to some sectors. If you cover everything, and if you have more than 50% enrolling as a first education into this route, that helps, of course. And you need your Einsteins, they should go to VT. And for example, in Switzerland, we make analysis, how many people who could go to the academic baccalaureate choose as a first education the VT route. And this, of course, makes the system attractive. If we can say, oh, our Einsteins are in the vocational field, but only for 4 years, and then they progress over. So the recommendation is work on this permeability, work on this progression route from one system to the others.
I would just add that one of Ursula's colleagues, Uschi Bacchus-Gellner, who does research on this, if I'm remembering correctly, the best earnings are get your vocational degree first and then your theoretical degree, and those people do best in the marketplace and have their wages increase better than a university graduate and better than someone who has only the vocational credential. And it makes ultimate sense that you would be a better engineer if you started by designing the machine to lift the cabinet and learned the mathematics and the theory afterwards, because you would know why you were studying theory.
Yes, after the cabinet fell down on your foot.
If you were doing it.
Yes, if I was doing it, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for that observation. So, 1 minute final comments, if any of you want to make them, starting with, doing it in reverse order, starting with Noel. You got a last observation for us?
So, two things. I don't know if it's an observation, but it's something for you to think about. There's a book written by Jim Clifton called The Coming Jobs War. And Jim runs, the Gallup organization does surveys across the world. And one of the surveys they did is essentially, what does the world want? And the answer to the question, whether you were in Egypt or Colorado or Boston or the Middle East, is you want a good job. And the objective of education is to prepare people for a career. If we don't do that well, as a country, we have serious problems. And as a world, we have serious problems. Secondly, when I went to Zurich, and I asked Ursula, I don't know if you remember this, on the second or third day, I said, Ursula, why do you do this? And she gave me an answer, well, we're a research institution, and we study this, and by working with other countries, it will help us. And I thought, that didn't work. So on the last night, after a few glasses of wine, I asked the same question. And what you told me is, Ursula said, the world has some serious problems. And I believe what we're doing here can make a difference, can change the world. I believe it then, I believe it now. And if we're going to be part of that change, then we have to put the shoulder effort into this and to work through the barriers that exist.
So the first part of my reflection is we need a Noel Ginsburg in every state.
Yeah, for governor.
The second is really around this adolescent development piece. If there's anything that has really changed my mind and moved me in seeing these young people in Switzerland, from carpentry shops that I've seen in rural areas to the kid with the little glasses sitting next to the hedge fund manager at the bank, it's that this is a healthy way for young people to come of age. And there's a wonderful psychologist, Robert Halpern, and one of the things he says when he's a big proponent of learning in the outside of school and in workplaces and social settings, and one of the things he says, if you want teenagers to stay immature, put them in the school with their peers and lock them up. And that's what we do. And any young person that you know is going to grow up much faster if they're in the company of adults. They see what the role models are ahead of them. They see what they don't want to be as much as what they do want to be. And we tend to infantilize our young people and think that they have low capacities, and we just wait till they wash their feet and comb their hair and get grown up, and then we might talk to them. And that is completely not what you see when you go to Switzerland.
I'm totally happy to be here, I have to say. And if I now feel this positive atmosphere in this room, together with my panelists, I'm really happy. I'm coming back since 3 years. since I start with this wonderful couple, Hoffman Schwartz, to realize, you know what, it's true. In St. Louis, once I did a speech about the Swiss education system, and then I say, I have a dream. And it was because Nancy Hoffman told me everything about your wonderful Martin Luther King. And I thought, oh, I have my own dream. And my own dream is that I don't want that people, that young kids are judged by their educational status, but by their character. And this is what I'm working for. And that's why what we talk after 2 glasses wine. And if I now feel that in this audience are people really who believe in that, and I can tell you why I'm working with the United States. When I'm traveling around in Singapore, in Hong Kong, South Korea, Chile, whatever, all the people are looking what the United States is doing. So if you can change the system, that will impact the whole world. And therefore, I'm really believing in that you make it, and you have heard all those nice doers, and you have the facility and the good network of Pathway to Prosperity. I believe in this project. Pathway to Prosperity will make the difference, together with all those states who come into the network, and if we can work together, I mean, our institute will work together with those states if they need that, but you have to do it here, and I believe in the United States you can change that, and if you change, the rest of the world will follow you.
As the last person, I'm sure you'll have something to say.
I will have something to say, yes.
One of the things I remember the most from our latest visit to Switzerland is we had a roundtable with leading business executives that cross many industries. And we asked them, why are you doing this? This is a gigantic investment of your time and money. And they said, as an economy, as a nation, we realized that the only way we could succeed was on brainpower. And the only way we could succeed given that is we needed to be number 1, 2, or 3 in every industry that we decided to compete in. And there's no reason why our country can't do that too. We've done it before, we can do it again.
You know, more than half the people around that table, a small sample, but had actually started as apprentices, and they were now CEOs. That sends an interesting message. I was just going to end, it's an academic institution. Nancy mentioned an author. I'll tell you the title of the book. This is Robert Halpern, Youth Education and the Role of Society. I'll also mention another book that happens to be out there and gave us the title of this evening's event. It's just called Schooling in the Workplace, a look across 6 high-performing systems and the role that employers play. That happens to be written by Nancy Hoffman. What they have in common is they're both published by the Harvard Education Press. Please join me in thanking our panel. Class dismissed.
We followed your instructions.
Great to see you.